Okay, so, with all the stuff going on in the world right now, I mean, Ukraine, Gaza, it really makes you think,
Yeah.
Makes you think like, are other countries going to be emboldened?
Right.
Are they going to kind of look at this and say, hey, maybe now's the time for us to, pursue our own
Exactly. Yeah.
ambitions,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think for me, China's been on my mind, just with
Oh, totally.
their long-held views on Taiwan.
All right, Taiwan, yeah.
It's kind of like this is a moment where things could shift pretty drastically.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's what we're going to really dig into today.
Okay, awesome.
So we've got this paper. It's really fascinating analysis, academic paper looking at eventual Chinese actions in Taiwan, consequences for India's sovereignty.
Interesting.
And, at first glance, you might think, okay, well, Taiwan, India, those are pretty far apart.
Right.
But this analysis really argues that what happens with Taiwan could have a huge impact on India.
Yeah, no, that's the core issue here.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're so interconnected globally that something happening over there can really have ripple effects,
For sure.
across the world. And that's what makes this so important, I think.
Totally. And that's what we're going to try to get to the bottom of today.
Yeah.
So kind of our mission in this deep dive is to unpack this analysis.
Yeah.
See, why is Taiwan such a big deal for China?
Right.
And then what could the fallout be for India and ultimately, for you listening to this?
Exactly. Yeah. What does it mean for the average person?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with this idea of, China's kind of fascination with Taiwan.
Yeah.
Where does this really begin, this whole thing?
Well, the roots, they go way back. You're talking about the Chinese Civil War.
Okay.
After the fall of the Qing dynasty, you had this huge power struggle, basically, between the Kuomintang, the KMT,
Right.
led by Chiang Kai-shek, and then, of course, the Communist Party of China, the CPC.
Okay, yeah.
And this conflict, it turned violent.
I mean, after World War II, it reignited with a vengeance, really.
Right. And that's where we see Mao Zedong's forces, the communists, ultimately coming out on top.
In 1949, that's right.
Right.
And that really forces the KMT to retreat. They go to the island of Taiwan.
Yeah.
And that's where they established the Republic of China government, the ROC,
Okay.
with Taipei as its capital.
Gotcha.
Now, meanwhile, of course, the Communist Party, they established the People's Republic of China, the PRC,
Right.
on the mainland. And it's important to remember, too, that Taiwan itself, it had been under Japanese colonial rule
Oh, right.
from 1895 to 1945. So it's got its own
Complicated history.
complex, layered history.
Yeah. So in essence, you have two entities claiming to be China.
Exactly.
And that's where this whole disagreement over Taiwan stems from.
That's the core of the issue. The Communist Party in Beijing, they view Taiwan as a renegade province that has to be reunified with the mainland.
Right.
And this is non-negotiable for them. Like, this is a core part of their political ideology.
Yeah.
But Taiwan, their stance is, well, we've never actually been part of the PRC.
Right. It's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
So the paper talks about a little bit of a, kind of warming of relations in the 80s, but then things get tense again in the mid-90s. What happened there?
Yeah, so, there was this period of relatively improved relations.
Okay.
Even a consensus in 1992. They reached a consensus on some basic principles, but then 96 tensions flared up significantly again.
Oh, okay.
Now, despite all that political friction,
Right.
economic ties, actually, they kept growing
Interesting.
in the late 90s, partly because the Kuomintang government in Taiwan at the time, they actually had a more favorable view toward Beijing.
Okay.
So that played a role.
Interesting. And then in 2005, we see China pass this anti-secession law.
Right.
What was the message there?
That was a really strong signal from Beijing.
Okay.
Basically, they were saying, okay, here are the conditions under which we would consider using non-peaceful means to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence. So that was military force.
Right.
And it was also seen as a deterrent against any potential U.S. intervention, if the U.S. were to get involved militarily to support Taiwan. So
Right.
the key takeaway there is China's actually formalized the possibility of using force.
Right.
And that raises the stakes,
Yeah, hugely.
for Taiwan and anyone else with interest in the region.
Wow. Like India.
Like India, exactly.
And then the paper points out that, things have gotten kind of strained again since 2016.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, I think you can point to a couple of main factors. The first is that under Xi Jinping, China's adopted this much more assertive foreign policy.
Okay.
Much more nationalistic.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have the election of Tsai Ing-wen as Taiwan's president.
Right.
And her stance on Taiwanese identity and independence has really been a major point of contention for Beijing.
Yeah, it's interesting how these internal political shifts have such a big impact on this relationship.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So the analysis also mentions this idea of, cross-strait relations and how there's not really this direct communication between the governments.
Yes, because they don't consider it to be a foreign relationship. They view it as between two parts of a single China.
Right.
Just with different governments.
Gotcha.
So they use this term cross-strait relations to refer to the Taiwan Strait.
Okay.
But despite that framing, there's no direct official government-to-government communication channels right now.
Wow.
Between Beijing and Taipei.
Okay.
So that lack of direct dialogue really increases the risk of misunderstanding.
Oh, for sure.
Miscalculation.
Yeah. And it sounds like Taiwan's position globally is pretty limited.
Yeah, it is. As of January 2024, they only had formal diplomatic relations with 12 out of the 193 UN member nations.
Wow. That's a small number.
It's a tiny number, and it's largely due to China's influence.
Right.
They discourage countries from recognizing Taiwan.
Yeah, the one China policy.
Yeah, the one China policy.
So basically, to kind of summarize this whole history here, Beijing has this long-term goal of reunification.
Right.
They seem prepared to do whatever it takes to prevent Taiwan's independence.
Absolutely, and understanding that historical context.
Yeah.
The Beijing's commitment to that one China policy is crucial if you want to understand what's driving them right now.
Right.
And anticipate what they might do in the future.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about India's relationship with Taiwan.
Okay.
The paper calls it a shifting landscape.
Yeah.
So what did those initial connections look like after India's own independence?
So it's interesting. India actually did have diplomatic relations with the Republic of China after they got their independence in 1947.
Okay.
They even exchanged ambassadors for a short time.
Right.
But then after the PRC was established in 1949, India shifted its recognition to the new communist government in Beijing.
Okay.
And cut off those formal ties with the ROC in Taiwan.
So for a while, India was pretty much avoiding any official government links with Taiwan?
Yeah, pretty much.
What changed in the early 90s?
So the early 90s is when things started to shift.
Okay.
Both sides started taking these kind of baby steps to restore some engagement. Mostly focused on economics, though.
Right.
So Taiwan established a trade promotion agency, TITRA, in Mumbai in 92.
Okay.
And India responded by setting up the India-Taipei Association, or ITA, in Taipei in 95.
Okay.
So initially, it was all about building those economic connections.
Right, rather than formal diplomatic relations.
Exactly, yeah.
And this kind of coincides with India's broader, change in foreign policy, right? The Look East policy, which later became the Act East policy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, India's Look East policy started in the early 90s.
Right.
And then it evolved into the Act East policy under Modi in 2014.
Right.
And the goal there was to deepen engagement with countries across the Asia-Pacific.
Right.
And Taiwan just naturally became a part of that.
Right. Okay, so it sounds like Taiwan's been actively trying to strengthen ties with India, too. The paper talks about their new southbound policy.
Yeah, the NSP.
Yeah.
So this policy actually built on earlier Go South initiatives.
Okay.
And it gained a lot of momentum after President Tsai Ing-wen came into office in 2016.
Okay.
And under the NSP, India's become a really big priority for Taiwan.
Interesting.
The goals are to foster this stronger sense of economic community.
Okay.
And to expand Taiwan's international presence.
Right. Beyond just those limited formal relationships they have.
Exactly, yeah.
There's a quote here in the paper from James Huang. He's the chairman of TITRA.
Right.
And he talks about how Taiwan basically neglected India in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that really shows you how much their priorities have changed.
Right.
Like, they're realizing that India is this huge potential partner, both economically and strategically, and they kind of missed the boat for a while there.
Right, they're trying to make up for lost time.
Exactly, yeah.
It sounds like China hasn't been super happy about Taiwan's, more assertive outreach to other countries.
No, they haven't. I mean, Beijing sees this as a provocation.
Right.
Especially under Xi Jinping, with his more assertive leadership.
Right.
They see it as a direct challenge to their one China principle.
Right. And then the paper talks about how the 2020 Galwan Valley clashes between India and China.
Right.
That actually kind of pushed India and Taiwan closer together.
Yeah, it's like China's actions inadvertently pushed New Delhi towards closer ties with Taiwan.
Right.
It's really interesting how connected these issues are.
Totally. Yeah.
The border tensions in Galwan, they were like a catalyst.
Okay.
Suddenly, there were a lot more voices in India calling for a stronger relationship with Taiwan.
Interesting.
Yeah, it really shifted the conversation.
It seems like India's past reluctance to really build those ties was mostly about, not rocking the boat with China.
Yeah, for a long time, India was being cautious.
Right.
They didn't want to damage their relationship with Beijing by getting too close to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And that definitely slowed things down.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there's a great quote here from Hashmi. He describes India-Taiwan ties as one of the most neglected and undervalued connections of the 21st century.
Yeah, it's like a good quote.
So it really speaks to kind of the missed opportunities there.
Yeah.
But the paper argues that China's actions on the border have given India reason to, maybe rethink that policy.
Exactly.
And maybe not be so worried about what Beijing thinks.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about, China's focus on Taiwan. We've talked about this kind of evolving relationship between India and Taiwan.
Right.
Let's get to the heart of it.
Okay.
What would the actual impact on India be if China took aggressive action against Taiwan?
Right.
What's at stake here?
So the paper argues that this would have huge consequences for India on multiple levels.
Okay.
First of all, it would almost certainly increase tensions throughout the entire Indo-Pacific,
Right.
which would directly impact India's interests and its hopes for stability in the region.
Right. We've also seen this increase in trade between India and Taiwan. What would happen to that?
Well, that trade has grown a lot.
Yeah.
It was about $1.19 billion in the early 2000s.
Okay.
Now it's over $8 billion.
Wow.
So a conflict would definitely disrupt those economic links,
Right.
potentially harming businesses,
Right.
and creating instability in supply chains for various goods.
Yeah.
So for the average person listening to this, that could mean, prices going up,
Right.
or disruptions in the availability of certain products.
Wow. So it could have a real impact on people.
Yeah, it could definitely hit your wallet.
Yeah. Okay. And the paper suggests that China's actions could also have a ripple effect on India's relationship with China itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how would that play out?
Well, China's assertiveness towards Taiwan could lead India to increase its support for Taiwan.
Okay.
Maybe as a way to signal their own concerns about regional stability and protect their own interests.
Gotcha.
And that would definitely strain the relationship between China and India even further.
Right, which is already pretty strained.
Exactly.
And India might have to focus more on its northern border, the LAC.
Yeah, they might need to dedicate more resources and attention to that border.
Okay. And then beyond just the, direct bilateral relationships.
Yeah.
What about the broader global implications for India?
Well, the global response to a conflict over Taiwan could set a precedent for how the international community deals with other territorial disputes.
Right.
Including India's own border issues with China and Pakistan.
Right. So they'll be watching that closely.
Really closely, yeah.
And the South China Sea that's mentioned as a crucial area.
Right.
How would a conflict there affect India?
The South China Sea is a vital trade route for India.
Okay.
About 55% of their trade with the Indo-Pacific goes through those waters.
Wow.
So a conflict involving China, especially one that destabilizes the region, could really disrupt that trade flow and hurt India's economy.
So it's not just trade through the South China Sea, right?
Yep.
The direct trade between India and Taiwan and with other East and Southeast Asian nations would suffer too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, as we mentioned, trade with India is a big chunk of Taiwan's total trade with South Asia.
Right.
About 80%.
Wow.
So any instability would hit that hard.
Right.
And then there's the trade with China, which is India's second largest economic partner.
Right.
And with other key economies in East and Southeast Asia.
Right. So it'd be a huge disruption.
Huge, yeah.
We're also seeing more and more investment from Taiwan into India.
Right.
Particularly in sectors like semiconductors.
Yeah, and that's really important for India's growth.
Yeah, it sounds like it. There's a mention here of a $15 billion investment in semiconductors.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow, that's a huge deal.
Yeah, it's a potential game changer for India's tech sector.
So the stakes here are incredibly high.
They are, yeah. About 250 Taiwanese companies have invested over $4 billion in India already.
Wow.
And this cooperation in the semiconductor industry is really crucial. I mean, you've got this planned semiconductor manufacturing facility in Gujarat.
Right.
It's part of India's Chips for Viksit Bharat initiative.
Right.
And that's valued at about $15 billion.
Yeah. So a conflict could really jeopardize all of that.
Oh, absolutely.
And the paper also talks about this strategic dilemma for India being caught between, what the U.S. might expect of them and their own desire to kind of stay neutral.
Yeah.
It draws parallels to, the situations in Ukraine and Gaza.
It's a tough spot for India.
Yeah.
They often have to balance their relationships with different global powers.
Right.
And in the event of a Taiwan conflict, the U.S. would probably expect India to take a clear stance.
Okay.
Because the U.S. has a lot of security interests in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
And that could put a lot of pressure on India to move away from their traditional non-alignment policy.
Right.
It's a real balancing act.
Yeah, okay. What if China were successful in taking control of Taiwan?
Okay.
How would that change things?
That would have huge implications.
Okay.
For one thing, it might strain U.S. military capabilities in the region.
Okay.
And that would change the balance of power
Right.
in maritime Asia.
Right.
And that could make China even more assertive
Right.
in its border disputes with India along the LAC.
Okay, and there's this mention of, authoritarian regimes sometimes using these external successes to kind of distract from internal problems.
Yeah, it's a possibility.
So that could lead to even more pressure on China's periphery.
Yeah, potentially.
The paper even brings up Mao Zedong's five-finger policy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That sounds a little ominous.
Yeah, it's a concept attributed to Mao
Okay.
that was never officially adopted by the government.
Okay.
Basically, it sees Tibet as the palm of China's hand.
Okay.
And Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh as the five fingers that China wants to liberate.
Right, bring under their influence.
Right.
And India's aware of this, right?
Oh, yeah. They're definitely aware of it.
Okay, it's interesting the paper points out that India stopped mentioning its commitment to the One China policy in joint declarations with China back in 2010.
Yeah, that's a subtle but potentially significant shift.
Right.
It suggests a less accommodating stance from India.
Yeah, and the analysis emphasizes that India's foreign policy has become more active and more assertive in recent years.
Exactly.
And they're likely to respond to any threats to their sovereignty.
Yeah, they're not going to just sit back and let things happen.
Right. There's a quote here from Yoshihara and Bianchi, and they suggest that a Chinese-occupied Taiwan could lead to Chinese dominance in maritime Asia.
Right.
Which could then change how Beijing approaches its land disputes with India.
Yeah, that's a worrying thought.
Yeah.
And with India's growing power,
Right.
any major conflict along the LAC could escalate into a full-blown war.
Right, between two nuclear powers.
Exactly. And that's a scenario with potentially catastrophic consequences for everyone.
So to wrap things up, the situation with Taiwan, it's not just some far-off issue. It really matters for India.
Absolutely.
For its sovereignty, its security, its economic prosperity.
It affects everyone in the region.
Yeah.
And beyond.
And ultimately, it could affect, you listening to this.
Exactly.
So we've looked at the potential for increased border tensions.
Right.
Disruptions to trade.
Right. Economic partnerships.
Yeah, and all these tough choices India has to make.
Yeah, navigating this complex global landscape.
Right.
It's not easy.
No, it really makes you think, how should India balance its growing relationship with Taiwan with the potential for things to escalate with China?
Right.
And what role can, you listening to this play in understanding all of this and what it means for the future?
Big questions, yeah.
Big questions for sure.
A lot to think about.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.